was coming together at that point. And that may not have been something that was clearly expressed on the 13th to the IRG and or cabinet. So first I wanted to ask you what your understanding of that situation was at the time.
First of all, from the beginning, from the approach of the very first weekend, we heard from various authorities and police of jurisdiction, don't worry, we got this. There's a plan. There's a plan, and for the second weekend, there was a plan. And we have a plan for this, and it's not going to happen, and we've got this, we're getting more resources. No, there's a plan. We kept hearing there was a plan. And even, I mean, we heard in testimony here that there was a plan on public health officials, lean on experts and science on the best way to keep Canadians safe. And because Canadians got vaccinated to over 80%, we had fewer deaths in Canada than places that didn't reach that. And every heartbreaking story I hear of a family who sat beside the bed of a loved one dying because they had believed that the vaccines were more dangerous than the disease, I take personally, because I wish I could have done more
and
to
I don't mean
convince people
to cut
to
you
get
off,
vaccinated.
but I only have 10 minutes, so thank you. That was helpful.
Presented to us, we had more questions about how it would actually work. It was not a complete proposal.
My last question, Mr. Prime Minister, when did you and your government start to become so afraid of your own citizens?
That's a very
I
unfair.
am not, and we are not.
Those are my questions. Agree with me that it would have been a far better outcome if you and your colleagues would have allowed the de-escalation agreement with the mayor to be completed, and there would have been no need to invoke the extraordinary powers of the Emergencies Act, including the significant and violent police actions and freezing Canadians' bank accounts.
If I could interrupt.
February 13th. So my question is, was this threat assessment provided to the full cabinet on the evening of February 13th?
In our reporting to cabinet, there was a reporting on the consensus reached by the IRG, including the director of CSIS, who recommended and agreed with the invocation of a public order emergency. We were not at cabinet dealing with whether or not CSIS had the authority to move forward with a wiretap on one person or another. It was a discussion on the invocation of a public order emergency, which requires reasonable grounds for the governor and council to make a determination.
So, sir, you'd agree that that document was not provided to the full cabinet on February 13th? You said a report.
Which document is that?
The CSIS threat assessment. And if I could rephrase what you said, you just said the IRG considered that report, it discussed it?
No. Throughout the IRGs, CSIS, as a par for a course, would mention that the threshold had not been met for CSIS.
Certainly relevant to the invocation of the Emergencies Act?
The invocation of the Emergencies Act wasn't because people couldn't find tow trucks. The invocation was because there was a public order emergency that posed serious threats to Canadians, and the inability to solve yet concrete plans to be able to actually do the work that Canadians were hoping to see.
Right, so I understand that there are various planning timeframes, but I'm specifically talking about the 13th and whether you were provided details of a complete operational plan to end the protests in Ottawa.
My understanding was there was not a complete operational plan to end the protests in Ottawa as of the 13th.
Okay. I'd like to bring up OPP 1851, please.
On coordination, and I would have assumed that that was done.
Yeah, and that could be done quickly from commissioner to commissioner, correct?
Yes.
All right. And for purposes of transparency, and Commissioner, I understand I've hit my 5-minute mark, and just for my last question, for purposes of transparency, we know that there is a consultation record, as we've seen here when you talk with the premiers, that there should also be a written record of consultation with the law.
And keep people safe, right?
Yes, and others as well, but yes, that is one of the roles of the Prime
It's
Minister.
not your only responsibility. I take it that is also the role of a police chief.
Yes. And concerns and expectations of citizens. That's an important input into leadership. But ultimately, we have to, getting the decision right is more important than making the popular decision.
And
Situation of serious threats of violence to persons and property across the country. There were threats to the security of Canada in the form of
The Emergency Economic Measures Order is not just about banking. It expressly deals with credit unions, insurance companies, trust companies, loan companies, securities dealers, and investment advisors, all matters that fall under exclusive provincial jurisdiction. While many of these powers were not relied upon by the police, the order itself caused confusion and represented a serious and, in our view, unnecessary intrusion.
6 weeks of evidence, there's obviously much for you to consider, Commissioner. The many aspects of your mandate include making recommendations to provide guidance for potential refinements to the Emergencies Act and guidance for future invocations of the Act. The Government of Alberta would highlight in this brief time 2 main points related to this aspect of your mandate. First, consultation with the provinces is required by the Emergencies Act. This is extremely important to our constitutional system. It is not a suggestion to which the federal government can just pay lip service. One aspect of this is timing. We have heard extraordinary evidence that the Government of Canada did not want to raise the potential invocation of the Act with the provincial governments until more than a few hours before it would be invoked on February the 14th, because they were afraid that the information would be leaked to the public. And yet, the Federal Minister of Emergency Preparedness himself spoke to more than one national media outlet the day before on February the 13th. Being suspicious of the provinces, especially after a federal minister has already raised it with the media, cannot be an acceptable reason for the Government of Canada not to have the required, meaningful, good faith consultations.
Second, maintain city services as much as possible, again in coordination with police. And third, it exercised a convening function in terms of bringing people together at other levels of government at both the political and official level. I'll remind the Commission what the City and Mayor cannot do, which is direct the police or the Police Services Board. City Council's oversight powers are extremely limited. They're limited to approving the police budget on a global basis and appointing 4 members to the board, 3 councillors and 1 member of the public. Council did use its power to revoke an appointment in this case, as we've seen,
and communicated information and operational needs to their provincial and federal counterparts. The response to the blockade also showed the importance of the incident command system, of advanced emergency planning, and of City Council speaking with one voice in this kind of crisis, and the important role that a municipality and government can play in supporting this kind of police operation. You've also heard how the necessary police response to clear the blockade had a significant negative impact on local Windsor businesses and households. Thus far, Windsor's repeated calls for trilateral government talks to create the integrated plan I talked about earlier to prevent and respond to such incidents has gone unheeded. Planning and first response to border issues cannot be Windsor's duty alone. As Mayor Dilkens noted, there must be an advanced plan that can be pulled off the shelf in the time of crisis. And this planning must start now. Despite the effective response to the blockade, the process revealed, as we have heard,
a singular desire to do the right thing. The objective was always to safely end the occupation and return the city to normalcy. While there may not always have been unanimity on what was the best approach to achieve the objective, everyone worked tirelessly, doing their very best under very challenging conditions. What is also not in dispute was the need for more resources. It was brought to the fore on January 31st, and the request for
principle of independent operation by the police, even though one or two of them had to be reminded of it from time to time. And with respect to the clearing of the Ambassador Bridge blockade, and we acknowledge and we are grateful for the great assistance we received from the OPP and other municipal forces in this. The POU effort at the Ambassador Bridge worked.
Would have been cleared without those tools. You've heard about Blue Water Bridge, Fort Erie, other areas in Ontario, which were not subject to blockades or occupations because of the work of the OPP using existing tools. So it's an important discussion that we've had and that we'll have in our written submissions about what are those existing authorities. It's a position of the OPP that there were sufficient legal authorities within statute and common law to, for example, set up exclusion zones, and that the Emergencies Act was not required for that.
Even with the benefit of hindsight, it is not possible to find that police services and intelligence agencies should have known this would become an extended occupation. Recall indeed that most protesters left after the first weekend. But as the protests settled in to become an occupation, the Ottawa Police Services plans that always contemplated some protesters would stay past the first weekend were required to evolve to address the new situation. There is also agreement that the OPS lacked the resources to resolve the occupation itself. Chief Slowly raised the lack of resources in a responsible way throughout these events.
Mr. Miller's opening statement and add to it what evidence in fact came out. It is our view that there was no justification whatsoever to invoke the Emergencies Act. The Emergencies Act requires several things. One, it could be invoked due to espionage and sabotage. Did you hear any evidence about espionage and sabotage? The answer is no. Two, it could be invoked on the basis of clandestine or deceptive foreign influence, or foreign influence that involves the threat to a person. Did you hear evidence about that? The answer is no. It also could be invoked on the basis of threats or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property. Did you hear evidence of violence against persons or property? The answer is no. Lastly, it can also be invoked if there is a group or persons trying to destroy or overthrow by violence the system of government of Canada. Did you hear evidence about individuals trying to do that? The answer is no. And the answer is there was no reasonable and probable grounds to invoke the emergency.
On that day that they had made these major mistakes, and they acknowledged internally that they were overwhelmed, did not have the capacity or the resources to police or manage these protests. They knew that. They were already calling it an occupation on Monday, January 31st. And from that day forward, they were trying to get help from other levels of government and from other police services. Now, what was going on after that? Well, we know that the Ottawa Police refrained from enforcement in most cases because of officer safety, including bylaw.
Disagreement about the interpretation of laws, whether legal tests have been satisfied by evidence, or whether laws or actions of government actors were constitutional. In that way, it might be useful for people to understand that some of the disagreements that were revealed through these proceedings are not uncommon at all. The disclosure of thousands of documents and close forensic analysis of those documents reveals that protests were unquestionably challenging and demanded attention. It's not surprising that there were disagreements with respect to how to deal with the protests or occupations. It's not surprising that there was occasionally colorful and perhaps intemperate language revealed within some of the written communications. It's not surprising that various ideas.
we highlight from the evidence that there was limited, if any, consultation and engagement with local First Nations governments of the territory. On this, I draw your attention to the testimony of two witnesses who had close knowledge of this matter. First, we heard from Deputy Minister of Public Safety, Rob Stewart. In response to a question from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs regarding which First Nations governments, representatives,
public order functions in a way that is safe for the protesters, for the community, and for our members. Now, the evidence here has been essentially undisputed that in the January and February protests led to
apprehended insurrection in Quebec. The Honorable Jean Marchand, the political minister of Quebec, sharply disagreed at the cabinet meeting. He presented unverified.
The Emergencies Act does not allow for the suspension of charter rights. But without the existence of a public order emergency, the measures that were enacted would most certainly be contrary to the charter. In the absence of circumstances amounting to a national emergency, they would constitute serious restrictions on fundamental rights and freedoms that are neither reasonable nor justified in a free and democratic society. So the question, was there a national emergency that justified these measures, is a crucial one. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association respectfully submits that this question is important, not only for what it says about the events of January and February of this year, but also because of what it signals to future governments about when parliamentary process can be bypassed to allow the government to rule by executive order and when extraordinary powers can be used. Second, the Government of Canada has offered a range of justifications for its decision to invoke the Act. Its primary justification articulates
on behalf of the JCCF and Citizens for Freedom, but we'd like to express our gratitude for this opportunity to participate in these proceedings. At the commencement of these public hearings, we stated that our goal was to get to the truth about why the government invoked the public order emergency. We wanted to hear evidence about whether the government met the legal threshold for invoking the Emergencies Act. And Commissioner, we have heard, we've heard evidence on many issues, but the reasons why the Emergencies Act was invoked is the primary and ultimate issue you should turn your mind to. I won't repeat the test for declaring a public order emergency because we've all heard it so many times. But I would like to address just one part of that test, threats to the security of Canada. In one way, this is a very high threshold for the government to meet, because threats to the security of Canada means more than ordinary threats or acts of violence. The definition requires serious violence or threats of serious violence for the purpose of achieving political, religious, or an ideological objective. In our written submissions, we'll be looking at, among other things, the definition of terrorist activity is set out in the Criminal Code and how it is similar to the CSIS definition. And in fact, some of the CSIS documents that were disclosed to the parties through the
I'm not going to shy away. It's very challenging to get this written because my hope is that once it is written and provided, there will be enough there that even if you don't agree with me, the facts will be there, the evidence, the analysis and fact finding. But ultimately, these are very difficult issues. They overlap. And people could have different views and will have different views on these things. But I can assure you I'll do the very best I can. Now, this brings the fact hearings of the commission to an end. It was, believe it or not, 43 days ago I first convened these hearings. Since then, we've heard from 75 witnesses, filed numerous overview reports, witness statements, witness interviews, and have introduced over 7,000 documents into evidence. You're a bunch of lawyers. I've rarely seen something that happened in February that has reached this point after less than 10 months. It is an amazing feat. Time has flown by. I'm sure you're the same, at least. Et maintenant, si vous le permettez.
And now, if you allow me, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to people who worked in the hearing room and to make sure that the hearings would take place. This commission was created and the process was executed by a talented group of colleagues, and that made the task a lot easier for me.
In fact, I've sometimes border blockades out west. And the two you probably know best, Eric Brousseau and John Mather, my God, have they been good. They have put out
privilege and an honor to serve as a commissioner. We have a lot of work to do to prepare and finalize our report. I assure you that we will keep doing all that is possible to bring you the answers to the questions that were raised by the mandate. You deserve nothing less than that.
Are possible, all that is possible, to bring forward the answers to the questions raised by our mandate. And as I said at the outset, they deserve nothing less. So thank you and good evening. I now declare these the fact hearing portion closed. I may not see a lot of you now that we move to the next phase, given that the submissions will be in writing, but I do feel I've made some friends, maybe some enemies too, but I like to think I've made some friends because virtually all of you I did not know. And it has been a very, very pleasant experience. And thank you all for tolerating me. And my I guess, difficult task is always is still in front of me. Thank you very much.
Folks, if you want to be kept up to date on what's happening at the Emergency Act Inquiry, including my live tweets and some clips and highlights that occurring at the Emergency Act Inquiry, by heading over to revolutionnews.ca/Emergency Act Commission. That's revolutionnews.ca/Emergency Act Commission. And of course, here, folks, while you're there, please head over to donorbox.org/Emergency Act Commission. That's donorbox.org/Emergency Act Commission. And of course, here, folks, if you could chip in a buck or two, that will be greatly appreciated, as it will help me cover my travel expenses, including my expenses on food, as bringing you these stories doesn't come for free. Thank you so much.